Adam and Eve. God creates two people. But because of their disobedience, he expels them from the Garden of Eden and leaves them to suffer in the world he created. Originally, he offered paradise, but because they disobeyed him, now all of humanity has to suffer. The biblical narrative of Adam and Eve has been studied and scrutinized by many scholars, who claim the story is most likely a parallel with several different ancient Mesopotamian myths, such as the Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Atrahasis tale from the Babylonians. I will attempt to reveal in great detail how these ancient mythological tales have a striking resemblance to the Adam and Eve story, showing the obvious relationships. In the Garden of Eden story, God creates Adam out of dust and breathes life into him. He then creates Eve from Adam's rib, which does not require clay, but instead simply a rib. Because Eve was created from Adam's rib, she is now formed from him. He then calls her Eve because she is the mother of all living. God has created a wonderful garden for them to live in, but he also has one command: do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He tells Adam that if he eats from the tree, he shall surely die. Eve, however, is confronted by a cunning serpent who tells her that if she eats from the tree of knowledge, she will not die, but instead, her eyes will be opened and she will gain wisdom. This sounds intriguing to Eve, and she eats from the tree and also offers some to Adam. This act of disobedience causes God to expel them from the garden. God curses the serpent to crawl on his belly for his crime, and eats dust while also cursing Eve to have pain and childbirth and suffering, which applies to all of humanity. In mythology, there are several instances where women are responsible for the fall of man, such as the Greek story of Pandora, who opens her box actually ajar, releasing pain and suffering into the world. Lilith, in some interpretations, was Adam's first wife, who refused to submit to him and left the garden, causing harm to infants and pregnant women. Shamhat, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, seduces Enkidu, which opens his eyes and civilizes him, making him leave the wild where he lived among the trees and animals. This leads to his friendship with Gilgamesh and their subsequent adventures, ultimately resulting in Enkidu's death as a consequence of defying the gods. Many stories in ancient mythology show a striking resemblance not only to the Adam and Eve story, but also to each other. This can be attributed to the nations or cultures passing on the stories over hundreds or even thousands of years. For instance, the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis tale have very similar stories where they reference the same gods but often change the names. This evolution also applies to the biblical tales. As civilizations became wiser and more educated, they understood the similarities, forcing them to modify their stories so it would not be so obvious. It is difficult to identify the parallels of the Adam and Eve story to these ancient mythological tales, but there are many pieces that can be put together from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Eridu Genesis, and the Atrahasis tale, which will begin to prove the similarity. In this documentary, we're going to explore these tales and compare the points that, while not considered by some scholars to be irrefutable evidence, are obviously the foundations for the Adam and Eve story. I really hope you all enjoyed the introduction to this video, but before we continue, I will ask for your help. I am very new at this, so I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments. Constructive criticism is welcome, good or bad. Please help me learn so I can offer the best content for you. Thank you. We will start our exploration with the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating back to around 2700 BCE. This story tells of the legendary Gilgamesh, who is thought to have been the king of Uruk, which is now part of modern-day Iraq. In 1650, James Ussher, an archbishop and head of the church in Ireland, published the Ussher Chronology, which stated that the earth was created on October 22, 4004 BCE. This chronology was widely accepted at the time and reinforced the belief that the Bible was the oldest infallible religious writing. However, the discovery of many cuneiform clay tablets, including the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1849, challenged this belief. These ancient texts revealed that there were much older stories and myths that predated the Bible. It is generally understood that the biblical authors had knowledge of these ancient stories and used them as allusions in their works. This forms the basis of our argument, showing the connections and influences between these ancient myths and the biblical narrative. Now, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine and 1 part human who was a tyrannical ruler over Uruk, where he abused the people using forced labor and endless battles. He also would have his way with women regardless of whom they were related to, such as nobles or warriors, and would also do the same to women on their wedding night. The gods decided to create a creature that would be able to match Gilgamesh's strength in hopes that this might make him a much more compassionate ruler of the kingdom. When Gilgamesh learned of the existence of Enkidu, he sent a temple prostitute named Shamhat to seduce him. This is where our first, although elusive, parallel begins. Enkidu was a wild man living amongst the animals in the fields and the forest. After being seduced by Shamhat and spending 6 days and 7 nights with her, he begins to become humanized and understands the ways of humans, losing his innocence. Adam and Eve were very much the same when they lived in the garden. They were surrounded by animals where there was no threat, and they were also completely innocent while living in a paradise of fields and forests until they were kicked out of the garden to live in the outside world, now losing their innocence and having wisdom and knowledge. To continue, Enkidu ends up going to Uruk, where he finds Gilgamesh about to enter the bedchamber of a recently married woman, but gets in his way to stop him. This ends up in a battle, which is a wrestling match between the two that causes the city to shake. Gilgamesh eventually pins Enkidu, but they afterwards become great friends due to their respect for each other's strength. To make a long story short, yes, this is a long story, Gilgamesh and Enkidu go on many adventures, such as killing the forest guardian, Mbaba, along with his 7 auras of terror, and then fighting against the mighty bull of heaven, an animal so large that it creates sinkholes with every snort of breath it takes. Enkidu dies about halfway through the story, caused by the disobedience of the gods after they killed Mbaba and the great bull, which causes Gilgamesh to think of his own mortality. Gilgamesh decides he must learn how to become immortal and begins a quest alone to find the secret of eternal life through the path of the sun across the water of death. After a grueling journey, he finally succeeds in meeting Utnapishtim, who is a legendary survivor of the Great Flood and the Mesopotamian equivalent of Noah. The gods grant him immortality while also placing him in Dilmun as a reward, which is very much like the Garden of Eden, where predators do not kill, pain and disease are absent, and people never age. Dilmun is another very obvious parallel. Unfortunately, Utnapishtim cannot grant Gilgamesh eternal life, but he can tell him of a plant that will rejuvenate him and offer youth. Sounds like the Fountain of Youth, yes? To get this plant, though, Utnapishtim puts Gilgamesh through a test to see if he is worthy. Gilgamesh must stay awake for 7 days, which he fails almost immediately due to his exhaustion from the journey. Utnapishtim's wife, however, convinces him to tell Gilgamesh the location of the plant anyway, and he does. So Gilgamesh starts on another journey to find this plant, which he is told grows underwater. He finds the location, ties some stones to his feet, and sinks to the bottom. He discovers this plant, and all is well. Afterward, though, he decides to first test the plant on some elders in Uruk, so he starts his journey back. He then finds a beautiful fresh body of water and decides to bathe. However, a crafty serpent steals the plant from him and eats it, causing the snake to shed his skin, showing the rejuvenation. So, we have 4 fairly obvious parallels in the story to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Our first is how, like Adam and Eve, Enkidu loses his innocence by acquiring knowledge. Our second is a quest for immortality, which Adam and Eve already obviously had in Eden because God said, "Do not eat from the tree of knowledge, or ye shall surely die." Meaning, if they didn't do that, they would have lived forever, while Gilgamesh is on the quest for immortality. Our third parallel relates to the last because, just like the Adam and Eve story, a crafty serpent denies them immortality, but in different ways. The snake steals the plant from Gilgamesh, denying him youth, while the serpent convinces Eve to eat from the forbidden tree, also denying them eternal life by getting them kicked out of Eden to suffer as mortals. Our fourth parallel is obvious. Dilmun, which is very much like the Garden of Eden, where pain and suffering do not exist and people will never die. So, we have clearly seen some interesting parallels to the Epic of Gilgamesh tale. To stay in chronological order, we are now going to explore the Eridu Genesis tales by the Sumerians. These stories are even more elusive, and while there are interesting parallels, it can be tough to relate these stories, but there are similarities. Before we begin, we need to rewind a bit, and I need to explain some things. In the previous part, I mentioned how Gilgamesh visited Utnapishtim in Dilmun. Clear this up, Dilmun is actually a Sumerian paradise. Although it is not mentioned specifically in the story of Gilgamesh, it is believed that Utnapishtim is in Dilmun. The reason for this is because the Ziusudra, the Sumerian version of Utnapishtim, has a similar story, but it is not as detailed. The later Akkadian version, which was refined and expanded upon, uses the name Utnapishtim instead, who was taken to Dilmun by the gods to live forever. I know this is very confusing, but I am researching all of this to make it as accurate as possible. While the story of Gilgamesh is considered one of the oldest Sumerian stories, scholars and historians typically reference the Akkadian version simply because it has more detail in the text. What I've been trying to avoid considering this documentary about Adam and Eve are the flood stories. However, this is nearly impossible because Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, and Noah are pretty much the same story. Utnapishtim and Ziusudra are the same people, just with different names. They are granted immortality and placed in paradise just like the Garden of Eden for successfully completing their mission, while Noah is not. As I mentioned in the previous segment, the names of not only gods but also characters were changed and the stories modified to fit the cultures the story is being told in. I hope I have cleared some things up for you, and at least now you understand more about some of the characters in these stories and the obvious evolution as we continue. As I move along, I'm also going to use the Akkadian versions of these stories, but understand, they are Sumerian stories that have been expanded on for clarity. Okay, now we will explore the Akkadians, who, as I have stated, are simply refined and modified Sumerian stories. We have spoken of Dilmun, which was originally created for Ninhursag, also known by the Akkadian names Belit Ili, meaning Queen of the Gods, or Damkina, when she was considered the consort of Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. For simplicity, we'll use the Sumerian names Ninhursag and Enki. In Sumerian mythology, Enki creates Dilmun for Ninhursag, but the land was dry and lifeless. Ninhursag said that despite being given a city, it had no river, quay, fields, or furrows, making it uninhabitable. Notice he says a city, not a paradise. To fix the problem, Enki directed the sun god Utu to bring forth water from the earth, turning the salty water into fresh water and allowing Dilmun to become a fertile land capable of supporting life. So, we went from a city, as Ninhursag described it, to a paradise. We will find many inconsistencies and contradictions in all religious writings from the Sumerians to our current text. The story of the creation of Dilmun starring Ninhursag and Enki is very detailed, but I will fail to elaborate more on it here. The plants about to be mentioned were created from Enki's semen after he has his way with another goddess, but a different goddess removed his semen and threw it to the ground. This sprouted 8 different kinds of plants we won't get into. As I research these stories, I have realized that the Sumerian stories are very sexual and use this kind of context throughout. Just an interesting fact I thought I might share. Enki finds these plants which he has never seen before, which are apparently the first plants to ever grow, and asks his servant, who apparently somehow knows the names of them, and he picks one at a time and Enki eats them. Ninhursag finds this act of her lover. Yes, Enki is her lover, and they have several children together. To be sacrilegious, and she punishes him by injuring 8 of his body parts, one being his rib. I have to considerably summarize and ad-lib here to tell this story because it would take hours to tell it as it is written, so forgive me. But I just need to tell you the basics so we can lead to the parallels. Ninhursag felt bad for Enki as she watched her lover suffer near death and decides to heal him. Again, ad lib. She brings forth 8 deities. Each one will heal one of Enki's body parts. The one who heals Enki's rib is called Ninti, whose name means Lady of the Rib and Lady who makes live. It is thought that Lady of the Rib is simply a pun due to her act, but regardless, interesting. So we all know the story of how Eve was created, and in Genesis 3:20, Adam names Eve the mother of all living, because she was created from his rib. Eve is the mother of all living, while Ninti is the lady who makes live. This is an obvious parallel along with the mention of the rib, two very compelling similarities in these stories. In the Adam and Eve story, Genesis 2:7, God formed man from dust of the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. This verse is often interpreted as God shaping man like a potter shapes clay. There are many Bible verses that offer interpretations of the same, such as Isaiah 29:16. You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay? That what is made would say to its maker, he did not make me? Or what is formed to say to him who formed it? He has no understanding. In the Sumerian creation, Ninhursag and Enki takes turns in competitive nature, shaping man out of clay and assigning them roles. As these stories evolve, when we get to the Atrahasis version, we will see even more details of how mankind was created from clay. As we can see, we have three parallels here. We have the rib mentioned, which is obviously borrowed. It is a rib. What are the chances that the biblical writers coincidentally made that up? We have Ninti and Eve's name, where Eve is formed by the same mentioned rib, and we have humans created from clay, which as stated is believed to be how God really created mankind. We should by now clearly see these stories developing into the Adam and Eve story. Now, we have explored the parallels between the Sumerian stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the later Akkadian myths, which as we have discussed are refined versions of the Sumerian tales. Next, we will delve into the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis tale. While these stories do not have specific parallels to Adam and Eve, they are interesting to explore to illustrate that many biblical stories evolved from older myths. Before we continue to the Greeks and Pandora, let's examine these ancient texts. To provide some context, we have mentioned the Babylonians. The Babylonians came after the Akkadians, but adopted much from Akkadian culture, including language, laws, myths, and gods. Many Akkadian stories were adopted by the Babylonians, so we can apply the following explanations to both cultures. For instance, Enki, whom we discuss in the Sumerian stories, was renamed Ea in both Akkadian and Babylonian cultures. Similarly, Ninhursag's name was changed to Belit Eli by the Akkadians and Damkina by the Babylonians. The Sumerian god Anu remained the same. These changes reflect the cultural and linguistic shifts that occurred as these civilizations interacted and evolved. Let's get started. The Enuma Elish, or poem, is thought to be a copy of an ancient Sumerian text. The name Enuma Elish translates to "when on high," which are the opening words of the poem. This story, known as the Babylonian Epic of Creation, is considered one of the oldest creation myths in the world. It tells of the god Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos and his establishment of order at the creation of the world. As I narrate the story, I will highlight the obvious parallels between the Genesis version of the Bible and this story. I hope this will open your eyes to the fact that many biblical stories are borrowings and near plagiarisms of ancient tales. To begin, the opening of the story already has parallels to Genesis. For example, in Genesis 1:1-2, the earth is described as formless and empty, and darkness is over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God hovers over the waters, which can be seen as chaotic primordial state. God then brings order by creating light, separating the waters and forming dry land, similar to Marduk's victory over chaos. The Enuma Elish begins with the universe as a watery chaos with no sky or land. The sea, personified by the goddess Tiamat, and the sweet waters underground, identified as the god Apsu, mingle their waters together. In their midst, the gods are born. In Genesis, this is similar to the earth being described as formless and empty. However, in the Enuma Elish, Tiamat and Apsu mingle their waters and the gods are created. This raises the question: if they created the gods, who created them? The birth of the gods is represented by the first pair, Lamu and Lahamu, who represent the powers in Silt. The next pair, Anshar and Kishar, represent the horizon. Anshar and Kishar produce the sky god Anu, who in turn fathers the god Ea, or Enki. The Enuma Elish story is very interesting, so I will summarize how it continues before we move on. After the birth of the younger gods, conflict arises as they tend to have rowdy gatherings, which bothers the elder gods. Apsu and Tiamat plot to kill the younger gods, but Enki, Ea, casts a spell causing Apsu to fall asleep and kills him. Ea then creates a shrine for himself and the other gods on the body of Apsu and lives with his wife Damkina, Ninhursag, Marduk, born from their union, becomes a powerful and majestic god. Tiamat, furious over Apsu's death, gives birth to a host of dragons and monsters and leads them and other gods into battle. Long story short, Marduk asks some minor gods to deal with Tiamat, but they all return saying she is too powerful. Marduk then confronts and kills her. If you find this interesting, I recommend reading the entire story. It is fascinating. After killing Tiamat, Marduk cuts her body in half, creating the earth and the heavens. As the story continues, Marduk creates humans, organizes the cosmos, and assigns the other gods their specific roles. To draw parallels to Genesis, another example is found in the poetic and prophetic books, where God is depicted as having mastery over the sea and sea monsters, which symbolize chaos. For instance, in the book of Job, God is described as having crushed the sea monster Rahab and piercing the fleeing serpent Leviathan. Job 26:12-13 and Job 41:1-8. Similarly, in Isaiah 27:1, God is said to punish Leviathan, the gliding serpent, and slay the monster of the sea. So, God created everything in the beginning, so he must have created these monsters also, yes? This means there were other gods, apparently, who either created these monsters or these monsters themselves were gods. Interesting. These narratives and imagery echo the themes found in other ancient Near Eastern myths, such as the Enuma Elish, where a deity triumphs over chaos and establishes order. Through my research, I have observed something very obvious. In polytheistic stories where several gods have specific roles in creation of the earth, heavens, and mankind, they often face struggles and conflicts. In contrast, the monotheistic religion created by the Israelites depicts their omnipotent God accomplishing these tasks with ease using spoken words. This, to me, shows an attempt to portray their God as more powerful than any other, downplaying the polytheistic religions surrounding Israel at the time. In a future documentary, we will discuss Mithraism and the god Mithras, whom the Romans worshipped before Christianity became the dominant religion and Mithraism was persecuted. This is similar to what happened to the older gods of Sumeria and Babylonia. As cultures progress, they constantly adopt other religions. It is commonly known that due to battles in the conquering of society, these conquerors often impose their religious beliefs on the conquered, merging the two and creating new religions. This also resulted from trading between cultures. Like the telephone game, a story changes as it is retold, with the most popular version becoming the accepted truth. This process is called syncretism, where elements of different religious traditions are combined to create a new hybrid religion. For example, the Roman Empire incorporated gods and practices from various cultures, leading to a rich tapestry of religious beliefs. A good example of this is the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Initially, a small Jewish sect, Christianity spread rapidly due to factors such as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, the extensive network of Roman roads, and the appeal of its message of salvation. The conversion of Emperor Constantine and the subsequent adoption of Christianity as a state religion further solidified its dominance. Okay, so now we will move on. Continuing on to the Atrahasis tale, which is very similar to the Enuma Elish and is believed to have been written down first. The story has influenced the Enuma Elish, which was recited by a priest during the Eridu festival. This festival celebrated the new year during the time when the Euphrates and Tigris rivers overflowed their banks, depositing nutrient-rich soil that allowed for productive farming. The flood stories of the Sumerians, copied by the Akkadians, are believed to have originated from these extreme river overflows, and the story of Noah is nearly identical. Considering the Atrahasis tale is very similar to the Enuma Elish, I'll focus on a couple of additional similarities. In the Enuma Elish, the younger gods were disruptive and rowdy, causing some gods to want to destroy them. In the Atrahasis tale, it is the humans who become noisy, prompting Enlil, the king of gods, to try and reduce their population by sending drought, pestilence, and famine. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, took pity on the humans and decided to help them by revealing how to survive these attacks. When Enlil decided to flood the entire earth to end the noisy humans, Enki warned Atrahasis to build an ark and save his family and 2 of every animal. Before I continue, it's worth noting the discrepancies in religious texts. For example, why would Enki, the god of wisdom and water, need to ask the sun god Utu to bring forth water? This likely represents the need for divine cooperation to bring harmony to the world, contrasting with the monotheistic God of Israel, who is depicted as self-sufficient. This highlights why the Israelites created a monotheistic God to show superiority. Once again, we see how flood stories, including Noah's, are variations of the same narrative, adapted to fit different cultures and their gods. The Atrahasis tale is named after Atrahasis, who, like Noah, is warned by Enki to build an ark to save his family and animals. One question that arises is how Noah or Atrahasis could have built such a large boat when shipbuilding technology was limited. It must have taken years, raising questions about the timeline of the gods' decision to flood the world. These stories often seem to lack practical details. Moving on to the creation of humans from clay, as mentioned, this is believed how God created mankind or Adam. In the Atrahasis tale, humans are created to relieve the lesser gods of laborious tasks, such as digging the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The mother goddess Mami, also known as Nintu, shapes humans from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of slain god Getsu-E, chosen for his intelligence. The gods then spit on the clay, and after 10 months, a specially made womb breaks open, giving birth to humanity. In the Enuma Elish, humans are also created from the blood of a god. After Tiamat's defeat, the god Kingu is executed, and Enki, Ea, uses Kingu's blood mixed with the clay to create humans. This act is meant to create beings who will serve the gods and maintain order. In polytheistic religions, much effort goes into the creation of humans, whereas the monotheistic God of Israel needed only to breathe life into Adam, showing his superiority. However, this is believed to mean he created Adam out of clay like a potter, not just dust. A parallel to the Adam and Eve story is that humans were created to work for the gods. In the Adam and Eve story, Adam was created to tend the Garden of Eden and name the animals, serving as a caretaker of God's creation. In summary, the Enuma Elish, humans are created from the blood of Kingu and clay to serve the gods and maintain order. In the Atrahasis tale, humans are created from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god to relieve the lesser gods of their labor. In the Adam and Eve story, Adam is created to tend the Garden of Eden and name the animals, serving as a caretaker of God's creation. These tales illustrate that humans were created to serve the gods and undertake tasks the gods found burdensome. The similarities across these stories show that they are not original but borrowed and modified to fit the needs of different cultures. We will be closing this documentary soon, but we will now offer a bit of some of the more recent myths from the Greek influences. There are some parallels here to the Adam and Eve story, but it is difficult to really apply them because the timelines when they were written coincide with each other to some degree. The Old Testament is believed to have its earliest text around the 12th century BCE, with it being finalized around the 2nd century BCE, whereas the Greek myths, such as Homer's epics, were written about the 8th century BCE. But there were very little interactions between the Israelites and the Greeks back then, due to the fact that those lands were usually conquered and ran by other civilizations such as the Egyptians, which many believe the New Testament was heavily influenced by, mainly the Jesus Christ story, which we'll be exploring in another documentary later. Look for that. Because of this, trade was ran by the conquering civilizations, which limited the interactions between the Greeks and the Israelites, which did not allow for any serious religious influences to appear. There are a few interesting parallels that can be found, though, in the Greek stories such as Pandora and Prometheus, which the Romans adopted from the Greeks. We will begin with Pandora. Pandora was the first woman to be created, just like Eve, by the Greek gods, who, for some reason, was given a jar, which many have misinterpreted as a box, that contained evil, which she eventually released into the world, which parallels with Eve eating the forbidden fruit in the garden, causing pain and suffering to all humanity. Pandora was named as such because during her creation she was given unique gifts from the other gods, so her name is Pandora, meaning all gifted or all giving, showing her to be a very prominent woman, just like Eve was the mother of all living and Ninti was the mistress of life, or the mistress who keeps alive. Just like Eve, who out of curiosity, after being instructed by the serpent, ate from the forbidden tree, Pandora, out of curiosity, opened her jar, releasing evil into the world, just like Eve releasing pain and suffering by eating from the tree of knowledge and learning the difference between good and evil. While these stories were written by different cultures who had little interactions, it is still very possible to see some influences did exist. The Pandora story, just like all others, simply attempts to explain why there is evil in the world, which is the same reason Eve releases pain in childbirth and suffering to all humanity. These ancient cultures were trying to figure out why all of these things existed, and this is called the God of the Gaps, where everything not understood was attributed to the gods. This story, along with many or all others, are simply metaphors for actions that can lead to unforeseen and controllable consequences through disobedience. Pandora disobeyed her instructions, as did Adam and Eve, causing, as stated, unforeseen and uncontrollable consequences. To begin exploring the Prometheus tale from the Greeks, there are a few parallels here also to the Adam and Eve story. In certain versions of the myth, Prometheus, along with his brother Epimetheus, was tasked with creating humanity. Prometheus shaped humans out of clay, and the goddess Athena breathed life into these clay figures. This act of creation is symbolic of Prometheus' role as a benefactor and protector of humanity. This story is very similar to how God created Adam out of dust, where, as previously stated, it is thought out of clay, while he also blows life into Adam, which is the same as Athena blowing life into humans after being formed from clay. I mentioned certain versions of the myth earlier. That is because, just like the Bible, both Bibles, the stories were written by several different authors over time, which allowed for different versions of the same story, which, as you should by now have noticed, has happened to all known religious writings going all the way back to the Sumerians, which is the earliest known records we have. As we end our exploration, I want to first point out how all or many cultures around the world, even though they may have never interacted with each other, have very similar stories that did not need influences so much, but instead just a common ignorance of the natural world. I'm going to speak of many examples, a few we have discussed already. Sumerian mythology. The Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninhursag involves the creation of humans from clay by the gods. Enki, the god of wisdom, plays a role similar to Prometheus in Greek mythology. Akkadian mythology. The Akkadian creation myth, Enuma Elish, describes the creation of humans from clay mixed with blood of a slain god. This act was intended to relieve the gods of their labor. Babylonian mythology. In Babylonian mythology, the goddess Aruru creates humans from clay. This is similar to the Sumerian and Akkadian myths. Greek mythology. As we discussed, Prometheus is credited with creating humans from clay in some versions of the myth. Athena breathes life into these clay figures, paralleling the biblical account of God breathing life into Adam. Egyptian mythology. The Egyptian god Khnum is said to have created humans on a potter's wheel, shaping them from clay. Chinese mythology. In Chinese mythology, the goddess Nuwa created humans from yellow clay. She molded each person individually, similar to hands-on creation described in other myths. Native American mythology. Various Native American tribes have creation stories involving the formation of humans from earth or clay. These stories often include a trickster figure who plays a role in the creation process. These parallels highlight the shared human experience of seeking to understand our origins in the world around us, often through similar narrative structures and themes. What does God of the Gaps mean? God of the Gaps is a theological concept that suggests gaps in scientific understanding are seen as evidence of divine intervention. This perspective has been used to explain natural phenomena that ancient cultures couldn't understand, attributing them to the actions of gods or divine beings. As scientific knowledge has advanced, these gaps have become smaller, but the concept remains a way to understand how ancient cultures made sense of the world around them. Okay, so this documentary was started by focusing on the Adam and Eve story and the obvious parallels between it and many others. But as I researched, I found it impossible not to mention other very obvious parallels such as the flood stories, etc. I hope to have opened your eyes so you can see that every story of gods, including our current one, and the creation of mankind are all just stories attempting to explain what people did not understand about the natural world. As we have progressed in science, including biology and natural selection, these gaps in our understanding have nearly closed where there is little we do not understand, yet many still believe in fictional characters that were created out of ignorance and often entertainment. Something I never understood is how can anyone possibly believe that we know all of this about creation and the gods and how they did anything when we're not even created yet? Certainly, there wasn't some scribe following them around and writing things down. It is my belief, and hopefully you now see it also, that these stories have now simply been politicized for control as they have been in the past, and we as humans should one more time evolve and let go of these nonsensical beliefs, which unfortunately causes wars and chaos more often than any other reason. If we could lose religion, the world would be a much better place, although, as humans, we would find other things to fight about, I am sure. It is in our nature. I hope you enjoyed this documentary, and if you would like to see more, please like, share, and subscribe. I would love to hear your comments below, so please don't be afraid to do so. I will answer any of your questions as best I can. I will try to respond to all comments. As I stated at the beginning, your suggestions are welcome. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.